They are among the most recognizable warriors in the Warhammer 40K universe. Massive figures in power armor, carrying weapons capable of tearing through flesh, metal, and even other space marines. They are known as the Angels of Death, and throughout the Imperium, their arrival on a battlefield can inspire hope in the people they have come to protect and terror in the enemies standing against them. But a Space Marine isn't simply a very large soldier. He is the result of one of the most ambitious biological and military projects ever undertaken by the Emperor of Mankind. A project that began with the creation of the Primarchs, continued through the Space Marine Legions, and eventually produced the hundreds of chapters that still fight for the Imperium 10,000 years later. And while we usually picture a Space Marine as the giant in power armor, that armor is actually the final stage of a transformation that begins years earlier when a young human is chosen and taken from the life they once knew. So what exactly is a Space Marine? Where did they come from? What are they meant to do? And what actually happens to someone who becomes one? Let's start at the beginning. To understand the Space Marines, we first have to go back to the Emperor. During the Age of Strife, humanity had become scattered across the galaxy. Warp storms had isolated countless worlds from one another, civilizations collapsed, and Terra itself descended into centuries of warfare. Eventually, the Emperor conquered Terra and began the process of unifying humanity under his rule. But conquering Terra was only the beginning. The Emperor wanted to reunite the scattered human worlds, and to accomplish that, he launched the Great Crusade. He needed enormous armies to carry out that conquest, but he also needed commanders capable of leading those armies. So he created the Primarchs. The Emperor created 20 Primarchs, extraordinary genetic creations designed to serve as the leaders and foundations of his Space Marine legions. There is, however, one particularly strange exception to that simple description. The Primarch associated with the Alpha Legion was actually a pair of identical twins, Alpharius and Omegon. Their existence was kept secret, and the two were often described as essentially one soul inhabiting two bodies. It's one of the stranger pieces of Primarch lore, but we'll leave that full story for another time. For now, what's important is that the Primarchs became the genetic and spiritual foundations of the original Space Marine legions. Each legion was created using gene seed derived from its Primarch, giving the warriors of that legion a direct genetic connection to their commander. The Blood Angels descended from Sanguinius, the Dark Angels from Lionel Johnson, the Space Wolves from Lehman Russ, the Ultramarines from Rabute Gilliman, and so on. That connection is still important thousands of years later, because the descendants of those original legions eventually became the chapters of the modern Imperium. But before there were chapters, there were legions, and before the legions became the warriors we recognize today, there was the Great Crusade. The Space Marine legions were created to help the Emperor reunite humanity. They were not the only forces involved. The Great Crusade included enormous human armies, fleets, the Mechanicum, the Emperor's Custodes, and countless other Imperial forces. But the Space Marines filled a very specific role. They were elite warriors capable of operating at the most dangerous points of a campaign. A legion could be sent into an enemy stronghold, deployed against an alien civilization, or used to break a defensive position that conventional human forces would struggle to penetrate. And unlike ordinary soldiers, Space Marines were created to be extraordinarily adaptable. They could fight in environments that would kill normal humans, operate far from conventional support, and take on missions where speed and precision mattered more than overwhelming numbers. For a time, the system worked. The legions conquered world after world, and the Primarchs became legendary figures throughout the expanding Imperium. Then everything fell apart. Horus, the Emperor's favored son and war master of the Great Crusade, turned against him. The Horus heresy plunged the Imperium into a massive civil war. Space Marines fought Space Marines, Legions that had once fought side by side turned their weapons on one another when the war finally ended. The Emperor was mortally wounded, Horus was dead, and the Imperium had nearly destroyed itself. The surviving Loyalist legions were eventually reorganized under the Codex Astartes. Rather than maintaining enormous legions, they were divided into smaller, more autonomous chapters. That basic structure is still with us 10,000 years later, and this is where the modern Space Marine comes from. It might seem strange that the Imperium would invest so much time and resources into creating relatively small numbers of superhuman soldiers when it has access to armies numbering in the billions, but Space Marines aren't supposed to replace those armies. The Imperium has the Astra Militarum for conventional warfare. The Imperial Guard can field enormous armies, tanks, artillery, aircrafts, and enough soldiers to overwhelm an enemy through sheer numbers. Space Marines serve a different purpose. They're the force you send when you need something done that ordinary soldiers aren't equipped to do. A chapter might be sent behind enemy lines to destroy a command center, cripple a weapons installation, eliminate an unimportant leader, sabotage a shield generator, board an enemy vessel, or seize a strategically important location before the main Imperial forces arrive. They can drop directly into combat zones, operate independently for extended periods, and fight in environments where conventional Imperial forces would struggle to survive. A Space Marine force doesn't necessarily need to win a battle by occupying every inch of a battlefield. Sometimes they only need to remove the one thing holding the enemy's entire position together. That is where their value lies. They are elite shock troops, specialists, raiders, and warriors capable of operating with an extraordinary degree of independence. And because they are so heavily modified, they can also be deployed into situations where the difference between an ordinary human soldier and an Astartes becomes the difference between surviving and dying. But creating one of these warriors is an enormous undertaking, and it begins with finding the right person. Space Marines are not recruited in the same way as ordinary Imperial soldiers. A chapter generally looks for recruits while they are still very young. The exact practices vary between chapters, but candidates need to be physically and genetically suitable for the transformation. They also need to survive the chapter's selection process, and survival is not guaranteed. Aspirants can be subjected to physical trials, combat, endurance tests, psychological examinations, and other challenges designed to determine whether they have the qualities the chapter is looking for. The candidate isn't simply being tested to see whether he is strong enough. The chapter is trying to determine whether this person has the potential to become one of its warriors. And even if an aspirant passes the trials, that doesn't mean he will become a Space Marine. The human body was never designed to accommodate what is about to be done to it. The recruit will undergo years of surgery, implantation, chemical treatment, training, and conditioning. Some aspirants die during the process. Others survive but fail to develop correctly and cannot become full Astartes. Those who do survive the transformation are eventually inducted into the chapter as Space Marines. But by that point, the person who began the process has changed in almost every way possible. The transformation into a Space Marine isn't one operation. It's a process that takes years. Over that time, the recruit receives a series of artificial organs and biological modifications that fundamentally change the way his body works. The exact process can vary between chapters, and the gene seed of different chapters can carry distinctive characteristics and flaws, but the basic goal is the same. Build a human body that can survive war on a scale that would destroy an ordinary person. One of the major changes is the addition of a secondary heart. This doesn't simply provide a backup in case the first heart fails. The two hearts can work together to increase circulation and help the Marine's enlarged body deliver oxygen and nutrients where they're needed. The skeleton is also transformed. The osmodula stimulates bone growth and allows the developing bones to become considerably stronger, while also changing the shape of the rib cage. The Biscopia stimulates massive increases in muscle development, helping create the physical strength that defines an Astartes. Other implants modify the blood, metabolism, and circulatory system to support that enlarged and enhanced body. And then there are the modifications that allow the Marine to survive environments that would be deadly to ordinary humans. An additional lung allows him to function in low oxygen or toxic environments, and even survive underwater. His kidneys are enhanced to filter toxins at an extraordinary rate. His senses are vastly improved. Other organs help him survive extreme temperatures, radiation, starvation, and catastrophic injuries. The Layerman's organ, for example, allows his body to respond to wounds with an extremely rapid clotting and scarring process. A Space Marine can still be killed, but his body is exceptionally good at preventing an injury from becoming fatal. And then there are the stranger modifications. The omophagia allows an Astartes to absorb biological information through consumption. In certain circumstances, this can provide information or even fragments of memory from what he has eaten. The Butcher's gland allows him to produce a corrosive toxin that can be expelled through his saliva, and the Sussen membrane allows him to enter a state of suspended animation, potentially preserving him when he would otherwise die, or allowing him to survive for extraordinarily long periods without food or water. And these aren't simply random abilities. They're part of a larger system designed to make the Astartes extraordinarily difficult to kill, and perhaps the most important organs aren't there to help the individual Marine at all. The progenoid glands preserve the genetic material necessary to create future Space Marines. Each Marine therefore carries a piece of his chapter's biological inheritance inside him. When he dies, his progenoid glands can be recovered and used to preserve that lineage for another generation. The chapter's gene seed is effectively its biological legacy. And finally, there is the black carapace. This implant is placed beneath the skin and provides the neural interface that allows a Space Marine to connect directly with his power armor. Because a Space Marine doesn't merely put on his armor, he interfaces with it. His armor becomes an extension of his body. But creating the physical body is only part of turning someone into a Space Marine. The chapter also has to change the recruit's mind. The aspirant undergoes extensive combat training, education, conditioning, and psychological indoctrination. Hypno-indoctrination can be used to teach information and reinforce skills, while years of training teach the recruit how to use his enhanced body. He learns to fight, he learns to use weapons, he learns the history and traditions of his chapter. He learns how to operate as part of a squad and how to function independently when necessary, and he is taught the values that will define the rest of his existence: duty, discipline, loyalty, honor, service. The process isn't simply about making the recruit believe that he should fight for the Imperium. It's about changing how he understands himself. A Space Marine is no longer simply the child who was taken from his home. His chapter becomes his family, his brothers become his closest companions. His Primarch becomes part of his heritage, his chapter's history becomes his history, and the wars fought by generations of warriors before him become part of the identity he inherits. This is one of the reasons Space Marines can seem so alien despite technically still being human. They have not simply been given enhanced bodies, they have been raised into an entirely different way of life. By the time the transformation is complete, a Space Marine is an imposing figure even without his armor. He is vastly stronger and more resilient than an ordinary human, with enhanced senses, improved reaction times, and a body capable of surviving extreme physical trauma. His implants allow him to function with little sleep, survive injuries that would normally be fatal, and continue fighting in environments that would kill an ordinary soldier. And then he puts on his power armor. This is where the Space Marine becomes the figure most people recognize. The armor is more than protective equipment. The black carapace allows the Marine to interface with it directly, allowing him to control its systems naturally and making the armor feel less like something he's wearing and more like another layer of his body. Power armor provides strength amplification, environmental protection, life support, sensors, communications, and a wide range of other systems. The Marine can fight in toxic atmospheres, extreme temperatures, and even the vacuum of space for limited periods with the appropriate equipment. And the armor is only one part of his arsenal. The most iconic Space Marine weapon is probably the bolter. A bolter doesn't simply fire conventional bullets. It fires explosive projectiles designed to penetrate a target before detonating inside it. For an ordinary human, the weapon is enormous and difficult to use effectively. For a Space Marine, it is a standard battlefield weapon, and that tells you something about the difference between an Astartes and an ordinary soldier. The weapons are designed around the assumption that their user is already stronger, faster, and more resilient than a normal human. Space Marines also use chainswords, power weapons, plasma weapons, flamers, heavy bolters, missile launchers, sniper weapons, and a huge variety of specialized equipment. Their armor and weapons allow them to operate as highly mobile infantry while still carrying enough firepower to threaten heavily armored targets. But equipment alone isn't what makes them dangerous. It's the way they use it. A Space Marine squad is capable of functioning as a remarkably independent combat unit. They don't need an enormous army behind them to be effective. They can infiltrate a position, gather intelligence, attack a target, and withdraw before the enemy has time to organize a response. When necessary, they can also do the opposite. They can launch a direct assault using overwhelming speed and violence to break through a defensive position before the enemy can respond. Drop pods can deliver them directly into battle. Thunderhawks can transport them rapidly across the battlefield, and Space Marine fleets allow chapters to deploy forces across entire star systems. One of their most important advantages is the ability to combine mobility, firepower, and resilience. A Space Marine squad can be heavily armed without becoming slow and cumbersome. They can survive punishment that would destroy conventional infantry, and they can adapt to situations without requiring the enormous logistical structure of a conventional army. This makes them particularly useful for missions where time matters. If the Imperium needs a bridge destroyed before an enemy army crosses it, it doesn't necessarily need 50,000 soldiers. It might need 10 Space Marines. If an enemy fleet is preparing to launch an attack, the Imperium might not need to destroy the entire fleet. It might need a squad of Astartes to board the command ship and kill the person giving the orders. That is the kind of warfare Space Marines are designed for. This is also why Space Marines and the Imperial Guard are not really competing versions of the same military force. They complement one another. The Imperial Guard provides the numbers, the tanks, the artillery, the enormous armies necessary to conquer and hold worlds. Space Marines provide the precision. They can strike where the Guard can't easily reach and accomplish objectives that would otherwise require enormous numbers of troops. The Space Marine chapter might fight alongside millions of Imperial soldiers without ever becoming part of the Guard's normal chain of command. They have their own commanders, ships, logistics, and traditions, and that independence is an important part of what makes them unusual within the Imperium. A Space Marine chapter is effectively its own military and cultural institution. The chapter master sits at the top of its command structure, supported by captains who command the various companies. Sergeants lead squads in the field, while other specialists fulfill roles that are essential to keeping the chapter alive. Apothecaries maintain the biological health of the Marines and recover gene seed from the dead. Tech Marines maintain the chapter's vehicles, weapons, armor, and other technology. Librarians are psychers who combine psychic abilities with the combat skills of an Astartes, and chaplains are responsible for maintaining discipline, morale, and the spiritual traditions of the chapter. These aren't simply jobs. Within a chapter, they are institutions with their own traditions and responsibilities. The chapter itself is also much more than a military headquarters. Many chapters maintain fortress monasteries where their Marines live, train, worship, maintain their equipment, and preserve their history. They have armories filled with weapons and relics that may be thousands of years old. They maintain records of their heroes. They commemorate their dead, and they teach new generations of Marines the traditions passed down through their chapter. A Space Marine may spend centuries serving the same chapter, so his relationship with that institution can become stronger than anything an ordinary human would experience during a normal lifetime. And underneath all of this is the legacy of the Primarchs. The loyalist Space Marine chapters ultimately trace their gene seed back to the original Primarchs. Although their individual histories and genetic lines can be complicated, that connection can influence the physical characteristics of their Marines, but it also influences their culture. The sons of Rogel Dorn inherit the traditions of the Imperial Fists. The descendants of Vulcan carry the culture of the Salamanders. The Blood Angels carry the genetic flaws and traditions associated with Sanguinius. The Dark Angels preserve secrets that date back to the Great Crusade. And the Space Wolves have a culture that bears very little resemblance to the more conventional structure of a Codex-compliant chapter. They are all Space Marines, but the chapter determines much of what that means in practice. The biological transformation gives them a common foundation. Their chapters give them their identity. But how does the wider Imperium actually see these warriors? For most Imperial citizens, Space Marines are almost mythical. The Imperium is unimaginably large. Most people will never meet an Astartes. They may never even see one in person. They might hear about them in sermons, military broadcasts, propaganda, or local celebrations. They hear about warriors who descend from the Emperor's own creations. They hear about chapters that have fought for thousands of years. They hear stories about individual Marines who held defensive positions against impossible odds or fought demons, Xenos, and traitors in battles that ordinary humans could barely comprehend. And when one actually appears, the reality can be even more intimidating than the stories. A Space Marine is enormous compared with a normal human, even before his armor is taken into account. He is surrounded by machinery, weapons, heraldry, and the symbols of his chapter. His very appearance communicates authority and violence. To an Imperial citizen, he can look less like a soldier and more like one of the Emperor's angels made flesh. That is where the title Angels of Death becomes particularly appropriate. They are not merely respected soldiers, they are symbols. The Imperium uses their image as propaganda because the idea of a Space Marine is powerful. If the Angels of Death have arrived, then perhaps the Imperium can still win. But there is another side to that reverence. Space Marines can also be terrifying to the people they are supposed to protect. They are genetically engineered warriors with enormous autonomy and immense physical power. They are not ordinary humans wearing better equipment. They are something that has been deliberately made into a weapon, and Imperial citizens understand that. The relationship between Space Marines and the Imperial Creed can be complicated. The Emperor is central to the religious life of the Imperium, but individual chapters have their own traditions and beliefs. Some are deeply religious. Others place greater emphasis on their Primarch, their chapter, or the warrior traditions inherited from their legion. Their chaplains preserve these beliefs and traditions, teaching younger Marines what it means to belong to their particular chapter. This is another reason the chapters can differ so dramatically. There is no single cultural experience that defines every Space Marine. A Black Templar does not necessarily approach the Emperor in the same way as a Space Wolf. A Blood Angel does not necessarily think about death in the same way as an Imperial Fist. The same basic Astartes foundation has produced hundreds of distinct warrior cultures, and that is exactly why we're not going to try to explain all of them here, because each one deserves its own story. There is also one major distinction in the modern Imperium that is worth understanding. For most of Imperial history, Space Marines were created according to the original Astartes template. These are now commonly referred to as Firstborn Marines. But during the 41st millennium, a new generation appeared, the Primaris Space Marines. The Primaris project was developed by Belisarius Cawl over a period of roughly 10,000 years under the direction of Rabute Guilliman. Primaris Marines are larger and possess additional biological enhancements beyond the traditional Astartes organs. They were introduced during the Indomitus Crusade and gradually integrated into existing chapters. Many chapters now contain both Firstborn and Primaris Marines, although the distinction has become less important as the transition continues. There is much more to the history of the Primaris Marines, including why they were created and how existing chapters reacted to them, but that's a story for another video. So, after everything we've covered, why do Space Marines matter so much to the Imperium? Part of the answer is obvious. They're incredibly effective warriors, but that's not the whole reason. Space Marines are also a symbol of what the Imperium believes humanity can become. The Emperor created the Primarchs. The Primarchs became the genetic foundation of the legions. The legions became the chapters. And every generation of Space Marines carries some part of that history forward. A Space Marine can therefore represent 10,000 years of Imperial history simply by standing on a battlefield. His armor may carry the heraldry of a chapter founded after the Horus Heresy. His gene seed may descend from a Primarch who died 10,000 years ago. The weapon in his hands might be older than the world he's fighting on, and the rituals he follows may have been taught to countless generations of warriors before him. That's why Space Marines occupy such a strange position within the Imperium. They're soldiers, but they're also symbols. They're warriors, but they're also religious figures to some Imperial citizens. They're genetically engineered weapons, but they're also members of ancient cultures that have survived for millennia. And perhaps most importantly, they're still human enough for that contradiction to matter, because underneath the armor, beneath the organs and implants and genetic modifications, there was once a young human being who was chosen to become something else. A Space Marine begins as a human being. He's selected while he's still young, tested by a chapter, and subjected to a transformation that will take years to complete. His bones are reinforced, his muscles are rebuilt, his organs are replaced or supplemented, his senses are enhanced. His body is taught to survive wounds, toxins, starvation, extreme environments, and conditions that would kill an ordinary human. His mind is trained until combat becomes instinctive. His old identity is gradually replaced by something larger: his chapter, his Primarch, his brothers, and his duty to the Imperium. Then he puts on his armor, he takes up his weapons, and he becomes one of the Angels of Death. There are only a relatively small number of them compared with the billions upon billions of ordinary humans living under Imperial rule, but that scarcity is part of what makes them so valuable. The Imperium does not need Space Marines everywhere. It needs them where ordinary soldiers cannot succeed. When a world needs to be conquered by an enemy, the Imperial Guard can do it. When a battlefield needs artillery, the Guard has it. When a war requires millions of soldiers, the Imperium can provide them. But when something needs to be done quickly, precisely, and violently, the Imperium sends the Astartes. They drop from orbit, they break through fortified positions, they board enemy ships, they hunt commanders, they destroy strategic targets, and sometimes they simply stand between humanity and something that should never have reached them in the first place. They are not the Imperium's largest army, they aren't even remotely close, but they may be its most recognizable, because the Space Marine isn't simply a soldier. He is a culmination of the Emperor's attempt to create the ultimate human warrior, carrying the genetic legacy of a Primarch and the traditions of a chapter that may have existed for thousands of years. And while all Space Marines share that foundation, the chapters have taken that legacy in radically different directions. Some are defined by their devotion to the Emperor, some by their loyalty to the Primarch, some by ancient shame, some by ritual, some by a particular way of war, and some by flaws buried deep within their gene seed. They are all descendants of the same extraordinary project, but they have become something much more complicated than the Emperor originally created. And that's where we go next, because to understand the Space Marines, you have to understand the chapters that inherited them, and every chapter has a story of its own.